Hello and welcome friends. In Unit 3 in Indian economy, up till now we have discussed about the role of the private sector as far as India is concerned. The public sector as far as India is concerned. We talked about the different public sector units working in India, public sector businesses operating in India. We talked about the objectives which are met by setting up public sector units, and we also understood that some problems are there which these public sector enterprises, PSCs or PSUs, public sector units, have to face. Now let us today talk about the private sector. I hope you recall that while discussing public sector, I had said that those enterprises in which the majority ownership is by the government, it could be the state government, it could be the central government, or it could be both the state and the central government jointly owning the majority ownership. Fine. So those units are known as public sector enterprises. Likewise, those sectors, those units which have majority ownership by private capital, private entrepreneurs, they are known as the private sector enterprises. So private sector is basically that part of the economy which is controlled by the private capital, right? Majority of ownership is with the private entrepreneur. The majority, which means more than 50% of the shares are owned by some private individual. It could be a group of private individuals, private firms owning a majority of shares. And you would find predominance of private sector in capitalist economies or the free market economies, where the government intervention, where the government role in businesses is minimal. So we have seen this and we have understood this in Unit 2 also, wherein we distinguish the capitalist economy or free market economy from command and control or a leftist or a socialist kind of economy. So you would find that private sector is predominantly seen in the capitalist or free market economies. Now let's talk about the private sector in India. We can categorize the private sector into organized and unorganized. Fine. Now what do we mean by organized? Please understand. Corporate industrial sectors, those private sector enterprises which are owned by some corporates, some business organizations. The examples have been given: the Tatas, the Reliance, for example Reliance Energy Limited or Reliance Jio, likewise Tata Motors or Tata Consultancy Services, likewise Jindal Steel Works, JSW, Adani's, who have been operating the airports, who are the concessionaire. They are building and then they would be operating the airports in some of the major cities in India, and are also involved in coal and other kind of commodities trade. Wipro, we know about Wipro, which is into the software sector, and then Wipro is also part of the FMCG sector. So we know about Wipro, and then Cafe Coffee Day. So these are all examples of organized sector within the private sector. And then we have the unorganized sector. What do we mean by unorganized sector? We have got agriculture. Please understand that most of the farmlands are not owned by the government, but they are owned by the private individuals. So this is an example of a private sector and unorganized also. Then we have got retailers, the Parchunwalas, the Kirana stores. They number approximately 6 crore in India, which means in India average family size is around 5 persons per family. So 30 crore people are dependent on the retail trade. So there are around 6 crore Kirana stores, and 30 crore of the people are dependent on these Kirana stores, and that is why you can understand there is a lot of opposition against foreign direct investment in multi-brand retail. Right? Multi-brand retail is when you are selling different brands from the same shop, from the same retail shop. And when there is FDI in multi-brand retail, you can have companies like Walmart coming here and setting up their own retail points, which would be a problem for these retailers here in India, these domestic retailers here in India, the neighborhood kirana store or the parchun wala that is there in your locality. And that is why this foreign direct investment in the multi-brand retail was being opposed to thin nail, right? So these are the examples of unorganized sector. And then we've got small scale units in cottage industries. Cottage industries, as I've already discussed, they are generally units which are managed by the family itself, and so many products are produced in the cottage industries. The beedis, the agarbattis, these are the kind of products which are generally produced in cottage industries. If you talk about Uttarakhand and talk about Pithoragarh, we have the carpets which are actually produced in these cottage industries. I hope you remember your trip to Kosani, wherein we saw this kind of unit. So likewise, some of the small scale units, for example, if there is an iron smith, Luhar, and he is working along with 2 employees of his, now this could be a small scale unit, and this would be part of the unorganized sector. Now what is the difference between organized and unorganized? In organized, there are certain rules and regulations which have to be followed by all the employees. Employees get salaries on time, while this may not be the case with unorganized sector. Then employees can also organize themselves into trade unions many a times. This is not possible in the unorganized sector. So this is a difference between organized and unorganized sector. And please remember that as far as India is concerned, 90%, almost 90% of the private sector is basically unorganized private sector, while we have only 10% which is in the organized part, right? For example, the rickshawala that you see, or the person who is driving an auto or maybe driving a car and providing a cab service from here to Haldwani, would be an example of private sector, but unorganized private sector. Fine. The dhabas, the roadside dhabas that you see, again example of unorganized sector. Now their processes are relatively less advanced. They might be using older technologies. There is no proper training given to the employees in such organized parts of the private sector. Well, that is not the case with organized sector. Organized sector actually uses the latest of the technologies. They have training programs to upskill their employees, and they work in a very, very professional fashion. So that is a difference between the organized and the unorganized sector. But as I told you, in India, 90% of the employment in private sector would be found in the unorganized sector. Now there's another categorization, and that is domestic and foreign. Domestic are those private sector enterprises in India which are owned by somebody from India, which are owned by some Indian citizen or a group of Indian citizens. On the other hand, foreign enterprises would be those which are owned by a foreign individual or a group of foreign individuals. So as far as domestic enterprises are concerned, we have got Mahindra and Mahindra, which produces vehicles, and it produces the commercial vehicles, for example, buses and trucks and tractors. We have got the Sahara Group, which is into entertainment also. They have got their own channel, which is into financial services sector also. So we have got Sahara. These are all owned by people who are citizens of India. We have got Infosys. Infosys is among the major IT superpowers in India, and again it is owned by Indian citizens. Then we have got Parle. Again the ownership is with India. You have been using the Parle products like Fruity or Maggi. I'm sorry, not Maggi, Parle-G biscuits. Maggi is basically a Nestle product, and Nestle can be categorized as a foreign firm within the private sector in India. Then we've got Airtel and Bajaj. You know about these products, you know about what they produce and what they sell in the market. They are all example of the domestic private sector. Why? Because the ownership is with some Indian citizen or a group of Indian citizens, while the foreign private sector units are, which are basically from some foreign countries. Amazon, HSBC, this is basically into banking. Hyundai, you know about the cars that they sell. LG in soft, LG basically is in white goods industry and consumer durables. Likewise for say Samsung, Paytm provides financial services. Hindustan Unilever Limited, for example, provides FMCG products. So they are all part of the foreign segment within the private sector in India, because the majority ownership must have been with somebody from some foreign country or a group of people from some foreign country. Fine. Now let us discuss a little bit about the private sector role in India. Number one, they contribute to economic development. You can see here that 75% of the GDP is generated in the private sector and only the remaining portion is generated in the public sector. So in that sense, they play a major role, and that is why many a times there are demands from different quarters that the public sector enterprises should be privatized. Again, private sector also generates a lot of employment opportunities in India, almost 19%, 90%. In fact, textile and retail trade and agriculture, they are major employers of Indian population, and they are basically part of the private sector segment in India. So there's a lot of employment opportunity that the private sector generates. Then the private sector also does a lot of capital investment. I hope you understand capital investment is a long-term investment. So for example, if you are purchasing machines, if you are installing some new plant, a new factory, if you are buying a land, they are all examples of capital investment. Fine. And so many private sector enterprises, they invest a lot with a long-term perspective. They go for a lot of capital investment. They keep on buying big machineries, they keep on buying land, they keep on adding more factories. So they are all contributing to capital investment and ultimately helping the Indian economy. We can take example of how when Uttarakhand was formed, so many companies, including the Nestle, including Tata Motors, they invested here in Uttarakhand. And you would recall that Rudhpur was the area, or the area that we today know as Sitkul, which includes Rudhpur and Pantnagar and Sitarganj area. So these were the areas where these companies came to and invested and set up their own factories, set up their own plants. So these are examples of capital investment. For example, now you've also know that Reliance Jio has expanded to Pithoragarh also, and they have their own network of towers. So that again is an example of capital investment. Fine. Likewise, Manesar in Haryana, we see that there are so many companies which have set up their plant here in Manesar in Haryana. For example, Maruti Suzuki. So another example of capital investment. So they keep on investing a lot from the long-term perspective, and in that sense they help out the economy. Fine. And how do they help out the economy? For example, if Maruti, let's say, decides to come to Pantnagar and start a new factory here, then what will happen? Don't you think they would be purchasing some land or taking it on lease? Don't you think they would be giving away a lot of jobs in the Pantnagar unit? More jobs would mean these people who have their jobs in Maruti, they would have money to spend. They would spend money in buying, let's say, bread, or maybe, for example, they would spend money in buying TV. And since they would buy bread or TV or other such products, what will happen? The demand for such products would increase. And since the demand for such products would increase, demand for TVs increase, what will happen? More TVs will have to be produced, and this will ultimately help LG and Samsung, because they will now have to produce more TVs. So this way, a virtuous cycle of growth would get kick-started in the economy. Fine. And basically I'm talking about the Keynesian economic policies, which you have already studied in macroeconomics in BPA second semester. Fine. Now they also source from small scale industries, which means they are basically customers to the products of the small scale industries. If I take example of Maruti Suzuki, they only assemble cars. They do not produce tires, for example. they do not produce steering wheels, they do not manufacture, they only bring in these components and assemble them into a car. But then who produces these steering wheels, or who produces the gear assembly or the braking assembly? It is the small scale enterprises. So small scale enterprises are able to sell their products to these private sector large scale enterprises, and this way the private sector contributes to the betterment of the Indian economy. Then private sector also brings in a lot of foreign exchange. For example, you know that as far as the service industries are concerned and service trade is concerned, India is a net foreign exchange earner, which means that India exports more software services than it imports. And you know that there are companies like Infosys who have backed projects in so many different parts of the world. Ultimately, when they get paid for the work that they do in these different parts of the world, ultimately that brings in foreign exchange for the Indian economy. Because they would get paid not in Indian rupee, they would probably get paid in dollars, which is a foreign exchange, a foreign currency. So the private sector also helps in bringing foreign exchange to the country. For example, Mahindra & Mahindra has been exporting some of its vehicles to markets like America, United States of America also. So naturally, when they get paid for it, they would get paid in foreign exchange, and this would add to the foreign exchange reserve of our country. Likewise, Maruti has been selling vehicles, cars in the Middle East. We have got Bajaj, which is selling these kind of bikes in Southeast Asia, in countries like Indonesia. So they all are contributing to bringing more and more foreign exchange to the Indian economy. Not only this, if they are profitable, they also deposit tax in the government exchequer. There are taxes like corporate tax which are levied on these kind of corporate organizations, so they have to deposit that tax. So in that sense, they are also earning a lot of revenue for the government, which the government can then spend on police, law and order, on defense, or on maybe providing subsidized food to the poor people, or maybe providing subsidized education, just like it has been provided to you. As far as BBA is concerned, only 4,000 rupees in a year. So where does the government get this money from? They tax the private sector enterprises and they generate tax revenue, which then they can spend on various welfare activities. Then they also complement the government efforts in fulfilling customer needs. So the government sets up its own enterprises, but generally does not set up its enterprises in consumer goods industries. Most of the enterprises you would find in those industries, those sectors which are very, very important for the Indian economy. So wherever there is a void left, wherever there is a gap, it is the private sector which comes and fills up that void, fills up that gap. For example, if you talk about the consumer goods industries, government is not into consumer goods, into manufacturing and selling of consumer goods, and you see so many companies are now producing consumer goods, including both the fast-moving consumer goods like toothpaste. So we have example of Procter & Gamble and HUL, including the consumer durables like LG or Samsung or BPL. So we have examples of these firms also. So these firms are complementing government efforts, and they are filling up the void which is left when there is no government role in that particular sector, like in the consumer goods industry, be it the FMCG, be it the consumer durables. Then likewise telecommunication, BSNL was not able to perform well. MTNL was basically focused only on the mega cities, the metropolitan cities like the city of Delhi. So naturally there was a lot of gap left, which was filled by the private enterprises. So we saw that Airtel, initially Vodafone and Idea, now is a combined entity, and then Jio, they have all tried to fill up this gap by offering telecommunication services. Likewise for education and health, government cannot open up hospitals or schools in every nook and corner. So we see private dispensaries or private hospitals or private clinics. Likewise we have private schools for education. So all these have come up to assist the government effort, because the government does not have the finances to spend on a very large scale. So it is for the private sector to assist the government in this by investing in these sectors of the economy, like I said, education and health and telecommunication. Fine. Then many a times private sectors operate much more efficiently, and the quality management is also very strict, and they also innovate a lot, which means that they are able to get the customer to buy their product or service. They are not only able to get the customer to buy product or service, but they are also able to retain these customers. Fine. So this happens because they are very efficient, because of which they are able to bring down their costs, bring down the prices of their products in the market. They strictly monitor quality, so naturally when they strictly monitor quality, what would happen? There would be very minimal chances of any quality defect, and the customer would always be satisfied. And they keep on innovating so that they can bring more and better and more improved products to the market, so that the customer remains satisfied and continues with the company, continues to buy from the same company again and again. So this is another important aspect as far as private sector in India is concerned. Fine. So for example, you can compare the services that you get when you go to a government hospital or when you join a government school, and the services that you get when you join a private school or maybe a private dispensary or a private clinic you visit. So there's a lot of difference between the two, and because of which the customer likes to go to the private clinics or to the private schools rather than going to the public sector enterprises or public sector schools or public sector hospitals. Fine. With this, we conclude the lecture today. Thank you very much for your time, and we'll continue the discussion tomorrow as well.